Good afternoon, everyone. I see we have a full crowd for our favorite sports commentator here. Before we get started, and sometimes we have new people, I have a clipboard here, and if you'd like to be on our month, I'm Becky Hogue, by the way, and this is my mom, Betty Moorhead, and she and my father started this program 31 years ago at Batavia Methodist Church, and then we moved to the library several years ago, and we were so grateful because we couldn't fit this crowd over at the Methodist Church any longer. So anyway, I have a clipboard and I collect email addresses. If you'd like to get our monthly email about the upcoming program, and then in August, I'll send out who our new program is for the year, what our program is. You can just raise your hand and I'll get the clipboard to you after we get going. But Mom and I want to welcome Lester. I did not look how many years you've been coming, but it's over a dozen. It's probably, yeah, longer than that. He emailed me yesterday and I sent him the list that shows all the books he's done all the years. So I'll count those up afterwards. But I know some of you know him from Chicago Tonight. Some of you read his columns. He's been all over the country and the world, and he knows a lot about sports. And then, how many Cubs fans are here? He is a Cubs fan. So, anyway, Lester, and we're so happy to have his wife Judy, who's been able to come the last few years, and welcome you both. And come on up, Lester. We're ready to hear what you have to say.
It's great to be here. I'm always flattered when Betty and Becky invite me back. I don't get invited back to a lot of places, so this is really a great thing for me. As Becky said, my job here is to talk about sports books, and I've got 3 books I'm going to discuss today. 2 of them were in the program. The other one I'm going to start out with. And in the world of sports literature, there are a certain number of books that are worth reading. There's a fantastic number of books that are not worth reading. And my criterion as a sports writer is that if you're going to write a sports book, you must first have read a book. That is my basis. So that if somebody gives you a copy of a memoir by Pete Rose, get rid of it immediately. He has never read a book, and he's written 3. Why has he written 3 memoirs? Because he lied so many times in the first 2, he had to correct the lies in the 3rd, and he still isn't telling us everything. So we have to be very careful in the sports books that we read. But I've got 3 today that are genuinely good books. You saw the first 2 on the program, but I want to start with this book called The Cubs Way. Naturally, I start out with the Cubs. There have been 5 books written about the Cubs' win in the World Series in 2016. This is the best one. It's called The Cubs Way, The Zen of Building the Best Team in Baseball and Breaking the Curse. Long title, but the author is Tom Verducci. Some of you have seen him on Fox Sports. He was a colleague of mine when I was at Sports Illustrated. He's the best of baseball writers, and he really does a fantastic job in this book. What he did, and this doesn't always work, in spring training 2016, he decided that he would follow one team, the Chicago Cubs. Now, they could have come in 3rd place or something, but luckily for him, he followed the Cubs the entire year and they won the World Series. So he had exactly the right access to the right players and the right manager, Joe Madden, and the right people to write a fantastic book. Now, some of you will remember the 7th game of the World Series. Easily one of the most traumatic games in the history of sports. He has in this book, I think it has 21 chapters, 4 are on the 7th game. That's how important the 7th game is. And you remember that game, the Cubs are in Cleveland, Progressive Field. It was a Wednesday night, November 2, and they're up against a pitcher named Corey Kluber, K-L-U-B-E-R, one of the top 5 pitchers in all of baseball. And waiting in the wings is the Cleveland bullpen, a powerful bullpen with Andrew Miller, maybe the most unhittable pitcher in baseball at that particular time. And so the Cubs have a rough situation on their hands, but this is the first time they've been in the 7th game of the World Series for a long time, and if they win, it'll be the first time in 108 years, as most of you know. So they start off the game. Dexter Fowler hits a home run off Kluber, first batter up for the Cubs. He hits it out, 1-0, Cubbies are ahead, and they build up a 5-1 lead. And then Kyle Hendricks is pitching for the Cubs, a Dartmouth graduate. He outsmarts the hitters, which is not that hard to do for some of them. And so he's pitching for the Cubs, and the umpire makes an egregiously bad call, and the batter gets a walk, and the Cubs manager very uncharacteristically panics and goes out and takes Kyle Hendricks, the pitcher, out of the game. A blunder. In comes Jonathan Lester with his catcher, David Ross. In a matter of 3 minutes, Ross makes a bad throw to first base. Jonathan Lester throws a wild pitch, and now the Cleveland Indians are very close. And pretty soon, it's a tie game. If he had left Hendricks in, who knows what might have happened. But the dominoes now are falling. And up comes to the plate a batter by the name of Rajai Davis. This guy is struggling to become a journeyman. He is not a great player. When the Cubs talk about the big hitters in the lineup, his name is not mentioned. But he plays center field. He's a speed burner when it comes to running, but he can't hit a lick. So he comes up, and he's up against now Aroldis Chapman. Some of you know who he is. One of the hardest throwers in the history of baseball. He can throw a fastball 105 miles per hour. He strikes out a lot of hitters. He terrifies them, because if you're going to get hit somewhere with a ball going 105 miles an hour, you're going to end up in the dirt, and you're going to be hurting for 3 weeks. There's no question about it. So these guys come up, and they're worried, and they're afraid to bat against them. But on this particular night, Chapman is exhausted. He's hittable. The ball is coming in maybe at 95, which a lot of major league hitters can hit. So Rajai Davis, he's up against him. He's scared to death. He's holding the bat like this. It's what we call choking up on the bat. If you're a regular hitter, a home run hitter, you hold the bat like this down at the end. He's holding the bat here like this, hoping he can kind of stick the bat out there and the ball will bounce off and maybe he'll get a hit. That is his dream scenario. Instead, incredibly, he puts the bat out there and he hits a home run. The game is tied. Cub fans, their life as a fan flashes in front of them. The 1969, the tragic team, 4 Hall of Famers and they couldn't win. Leon Durham, the ball going through his legs in San Diego, and the end of another nightmare season. And then, of course, Steve Bartman in left field. All of these things flash before your eyes as you see this home run leave the park. Judy and I were watching at home, and we're in the kitchen, and she saw the home run. She saw what happened to me as a Cub fan, and she went and called 911. Cardiac arrest. The situation is very bad. The game is tied. They're playing in Cleveland, which means Cleveland has the advantage. They have the last at bat. Everything is looking terrible for the Cubs, and then the rain comes. The rain comes. And we have the rain delay. The greatest rain delay in the history of sports. As the Cubs are leaving the field, their heads are down, they're dejected, they're discouraged, they know the dream season is coming to a terrible end. But Jason Hayward, the right fielder, who's having a terrible year, he's another Dartmouth guy. His parents met at Dartmouth. He didn't go to Dartmouth, he's a baseball, but his parents said, why is Dartmouth part of this? I don't know. I went to Princeton, I just have to say this. Nothing I can do. So Jason Hayward, as these 25 guys are coming in, he says, all right, everybody, in the weight room, players only. They all go into the weight room. One of them, Chapman, the guy who gave up the home run, he's crying, he's sobbing, he is so upset. They go into the weight room, and Hayward gives them the big speech. We are the best team in baseball. We're going to go back out there. We are going to show them that we are the best team in baseball. And he just pumps them up. And incredibly, the rain delay, about the time he's finished, is over. 17 minutes long, that's all it was. And so they go back out there. The team that goes back out there is different from the team that came in. Now they're up, they're laughing, they're ready. And sure enough, Schwarber, Montero, Zobrist all get hits, and they move ahead, and the Cubs win the World Series. So the rain delay is the key to the whole thing. And Judy and I live in Chicago, and I want to show you this. This is the Chicago flag. It's the official Chicago flag. You've seen it around. Yeah. The two blue stripes are for the north and south branch of the Chicago River. The stars are for Fort Dearborn, the Great Chicago Fire of 1871, the World's Fair of 1893, and the Columbian Exposition of 1933. So my proposal is one more star for the rain delay of 2016. So if you see somebody from Chicago, tell them you know what should be done to the flag. But this book, if you know somebody who's a Cub fan or a baseball fan or who just likes good writing, this is the perfect gift. Cubs Way by Tom Verducci. Excellent book. One of the best sports books probably of all time. Top 10, certainly. Of all the books that I've talked about here over the years, this is certainly in the top 1 or 2. The other book that I just want to mention briefly is a book called Smart Baseball. This is for the serious baseball fan. This is for the baseball fan who knows the names of all the players and the numbers on their uniforms and their statistics. And this explains how statistics work in baseball. If you read one chapter in here, you will learn how an algorithm works. I've read the chapter twice. Each time I think I know how the algorithm works, but it's one of those ideas that disappears from your mind as soon as you put the book down. So, it's a great. This is a guy who was a colleague of mine, Keith Law at ESPN. It's very interesting. The writing is not sensational, but if you're a serious baseball fan interested in the numbers and the history and so on, this is a very good book. Now, the main book for today is this wonderful volume. It is a biography of Arnold Palmer. Now, some of you a little younger may think Arnold Palmer is a combination of lemonade and iced tea. It's a golfer. The most interesting golfer of all time, Tiger Woods notwithstanding. He came along just as television was coming into sports. He's a charismatic, wonderful character. For a while, he was the very best golfer, and this is the best book on his life. It's by a guy named Tom Callahan. He is a friend of one of Judy's and my very good friends. We've met him a couple times. He's a very interesting guy, and most importantly, he is a guy who was around Palmer from the 1970s until he died a couple of years ago. And so he has a firm grip on all that is Arnold Palmer, and basically it's a good story in a good book about a good guy who did a lot of good things. And he also played a very good game of golf. Easily one of the most charismatic characters in sports. As he was playing in tournaments, he had a group of fans who would follow him around. Jack Nicklaus could be over here on hole number 3. Palmer's over here on hole number 4. All the crowd will be over there. Everybody followed him. He was just one of those guys that you wanted to be around. He was not the best ever to play the game. That would be Nicklaus, Tiger Woods, Ben Hogan, maybe Bobby Jones. But he was the best golfer for the game. He did more for the game and for other golfers than anybody ever did. And no other golfer has been so widely known or so loved by his fans. Interestingly, the way Callahan does the book, there's a lot of great material in here about golf, about its history, and about other golfers. For example, the great Ben Hogan, the first of the great golfers. When you're done reading this book, you don't like Ben Hogan very much. He was an arrogant, rude character, a fantastic golfer, but not one who wanted to be around any other people. He wanted to be by himself. And then you get a great account of Jack Nicklaus, who came on after Palmer was established as one of the champions. Nicklaus comes along. He was kind of a big guy. He had no great charisma to him, but he and Palmer, who were rivals for 10 years, finally became great friends, and they would play exhibitions together, and people got to know Nicklaus as more or less as a friend of Palmer's. And then Nicklaus has won more tournaments and more major tournaments than any other player. So Nicklaus you'd probably have to rank as number 1. Palmer did so well, so fast. He grew up in Latrobe, Pennsylvania. Like many golfers, he grew up right on a golf course. His father was the greenskeeper of the local golf club in Latrobe, Pennsylvania. His father worked his way up and became the teaching professional at that golf club. And when Palmer was making big money, he simply bought the club. So he became the owner of the whole place by the time he was done. His father was a difficult character. He could be very hard on his son. Even when his son would win the United States Open or the Masters or one of the major tournaments, the father would always say, well, here's what you did wrong on the 16th hole. He was not one to praise his son, even though he had all this success. Palmer, however, was a totally positive guy. He encouraged other players. He would help other players in the course of the tournament. He had an office at that golf club in Latrobe, Pennsylvania, and on the wall he had a saying that I will read to you. This is in the book. If you think you are beaten, you are. If you dare not, you don't. If you'd like to win, but you think you can't, it's almost certain you won't. Life's battles don't always go to the strongest or fastest man, but sooner or later the man who wins is the man who thinks he can. And that was really Palmer's philosophy. He would be, if you follow golf, Palmer was a guy who could drive the ball off the tee longer than almost any other player. He had powerful arms, enormous hands. He had the hands of a baseball player. And he had a violent swing that allowed him to hit the ball much further than people had ordinarily been hitting the ball at that time. And sometimes he would hit these enormous long drives. They'd go off into the long grass. There'd be a very difficult shot. There would be a safe way to play the hole, and there would be the challenging, daring way to play the hole, and he always took the challenging and daring way. And more often than not, he succeeded. And that was one of the things that his fans liked, that he would try to do these almost impossible things. The stories in here include stories from other golf writers. There's a famous golf writer named Dan Jenkins. He was on Sports Illustrated. And then there's a guy who became kind of Palmer's official writer, a guy named Bob Drum. He was on the Pittsburgh Press. And Drum once said that he wrote 5,000 stories about Arnold Palmer. He quoted him in every single story. Half the time he could not find him, and Palmer still thinks he said all those things that are in Drum's articles. He really became kind of the king of all the golfers, and they referred to him as the king. In 1960, when he won 8 tournaments, he came from behind in the Masters at Augusta, birdied the last 2 holes, and he'd be charging down the fairway. He walked faster than the other golfers, so that was really his beginning. Interestingly, in Latrobe, Pennsylvania, as he grew up, his best friend was Fred Rogers. Mr. Rogers. Can you believe this? Latrobe, Pennsylvania's got about 100 people, and 2 of them are Arnold Palmer and Mr. Rogers. How does this happen? But they were great buddies, and they would make model planes together from balsa wood. Some of you are old enough to remember those days. You paint them and all the decals. It's a wonderful thing to be able to do. They would make model airplanes together, and then as they matured and became Mr. Rogers and Arnold Palmer, both of them had their own planes, the actual size. They didn't need model airplanes anymore. Back then, of course, you had to serve in the military. Palmer served in the Coast Guard for 3 years. He actually served in the Coast Guard. He was not playing golf for the Coast Guard. I told you about Hogan. Now, at a certain point, Palmer starts to make some significant money, and he meets a guy named Mark McCormick. Mark McCormick became one of the historic figures in American sports. McCormick was a very good golfer himself. He was the godson of Carl Sandburg, the poet. Big shoulders, the great Chicago poet. And he went to the Yale Law School. He learned a little bit about business, and he and Palmer met at an amateur tournament, and Palmer said, maybe you could be my manager. And so that's how McCormick started his sports management business. He had Palmer as a client. You couldn't start out with a better client because Palmer was going to make so much money. And by the time he was done, McCormick had a firm called IMG, International Management Group, that was in 80 offices in 30 countries. And they once represented Pope John Paul on a speaking tour. I mean, he represented everybody. And he was in that, according to Callahan, our writer, he was in the same category as Ben Hogan. You didn't want to be around him. And there is a body of thought that McCormick had Palmer doing so many business deals. He was manufacturing golf clubs. He was manufacturing golf balls. He was doing all this stuff that he didn't win as many tournaments as he should have because he was distracted by all the money that he was making and by all the obligations that he had with those companies. The first deal that Palmer had was with the Wilson Meat Packing Company, and it was Palmer who got them into the sporting goods business, which they're still in. And McCormick, when he realized how little Palmer was getting from the Wilson Meat Packing Company, tried to break the deal, tried to renege on the contract. He couldn't get anywhere, so they had to wait until it expired. The deal expired November 1st of 1963. That's when McCormick then took over, and really the world of sports changed. Ever since then, athletes have been able to do so many things other than play their sports to make so much money. Even in his 80s, as he was nearing the end of his life, Palmer was taking in $40 million a year from these businesses. It's amazing. Michael Jordan now is still taking in $80 to $100 million a year, even though he hasn't played for years and is just doing a lousy job as an owner of a team. But so there is such incredible money here. And when you look at the tournaments, there's not much doubt that Palmer probably could have done much better as a player. There are 4 major tournaments in golf, and then there's a couple dozen other ones during the year. The majors are the measure of the greatness of a golfer. And Palmer was winning majors for 6 years. Gary Player was winning majors for 20 years. Nicklaus was winning majors for 25 years. Hence, Player and Nicklaus won more of these tournaments than Palmer did. Palmer was a great guy with the fans on the golf course. He had a memory for names that was phenomenal. There would be somebody in a crowd of people, they would be near his ball in the grass, and he would be chatting with them. He'd be talking to them, and then he'd remember their name. He'd see them the next year at the same tournament, and he'd say, "Hey, Charlie, how you doing?" It was amazing what he could do. Now, Judy is not gonna like this story, but there was a time Palmer is marching down the fairway, and over here on the side is a porta-san. You know what I mean? A porta-san, portable bathroom that is on the golf course for the fans to use. He hits the ball, and it lands right near the porta-san, 2 feet away from the door. And incredibly, there's a guy in there. There's a guy in there. And he opens the door to come out. He sees Arnold Palmer, and he closes the door and goes back in. He was so startled to see the great Palmer. And Palmer, fan-centric guy that he is, he says, "I can't hit the ball with you in there. You're going to have to come out." So now the guy has to come out, and there's 10,000 people watching this. And for the rest of the day, around the golf course, he's the guy that was in the porta-san. They're all pointing at him. He had to leave early. He couldn't take it. But there's a number of these stories in this book, and in 1963, Palmer was in a playoff. That means there's only 2 people left in the tournament. He is trying to win the tournament, and he has a chip shot, a short shot to the green, and he's there, and the protocol and the etiquette at a golf tournament is you have to be totally silent as the player is addressing the ball and about to hit the ball. Now, this doesn't happen in football or baseball or basketball, but for some reason, golfers must have absolute silence. I have never understood it, but that's the way it is. So he's getting ready to hit the ball, and back here there's a little boy who is crying. So Palmer, if it was Tiger Woods, he would look back there and he would scowl and growl at the little boy and tell him to shut up. With Palmer, he goes back there, he picks up the little boy, and he talks to him, gets his name, and gives him back to the mother. Then he goes back to the ball. This is in Callahan's book. He goes back to the ball, and now the boy is crying again. And Palmer can hear something is muffling his crying. And he looks back. He says, wait a minute. Don't choke him. It's just a golf tournament. And so he rescues the boy from his mother, who's trying to keep him from there are numerous other great fan stories. Let me just, I want to quote a couple of them from the book here. Palmer had a thriving business. He had an enormous staff of people working for him. He got enormous quantities of mail. People could write a letter to Arnold Palmer, Latrobe, Pennsylvania, and that's all it took. It would land in his office. And he spent in excess of $100,000 a year on staff answering the letters. He felt compelled to answer all the letters. And he also answered phone calls. People would call. So we're now at Christmas morning, 1967, 1:06 in the morning. And a guy in Toronto named Peter Deeks decides that he wants to call the great Arnold Palmer. He's just a fan. Somehow, there was some beer involved in this. Somehow he gets the idea, I'm going to call Arnold Palmer. So he calls information in Latrobe, Pennsylvania, and sure enough, there is his number. He calls, he dials the number, and he says hello. And this guy, Peter Deeks, says, is Arnold there? And he says, this is Arnold speaking. And the kid says, I hope I'm not bothering you. Palmer says, no, I'm putting presents under the tree for his wife, Winnie, and their two daughters, Amy and Peggy. They spoke for 12 minutes. 1:06 in the morning. Who would do this? Wouldn't you hang up on? They spoke for 12 minutes. 22 years later, the guy's brother, this is the guy who called Palmer at 1:06, he's got a brother. The brother gives him 2 Christmas gifts. The smaller one says, open me first. And it was a video, and on comes Arnold Palmer. And he says, hi, I would like to wish you, Peter, Wendy, and Sarah, and Jocelyn a very Merry Christmas. Peter, do me a favor and call me again, but don't make it on Christmas Eve, okay? It's Palmer in a video. That's the kind of guy that he was. And then here's a letter that he got from a brother by the name of Adam Marcoulier. And he writes a letter to Palmer saying, my brother and I are devoted to the game of golf. We both have scholarships to play golf in college. We are big fans of yours, and I think it would be a wonderful thing if you could write a letter to my brother and encourage him because he's a little bit down about his golf game. He writes a letter to Palmer, and Palmer then writes to this guy, to the brother, Dear Nate, I understand from your brother Adam that you are quite a golfer and a great younger brother. I hear you've won several junior tournaments. As you graduate from high school and continue to college, I think you will find life to be enjoyable and fulfilling if you follow this advice. He's giving this kid he's never seen this. Courtesy and respect are timeless principles as well as good manners. Knowing when to speak is just as important as knowing what you say. Know how to win by following rules. This is all the advice he gives him. Arnold Palmer, and then he signs the letter. I hope this kid kept the letter. Then there are 2 guys who are serving in Vietnam in the war, and they are practicing. They have time on their hands, and they're in this sandy area, and so they are practicing shots from the sand so that when they return to the United States, they will be great sand trap or bunker players. And meanwhile, the Viet Cong, all the other stuff, but this is what they're doing when they have a little bit of time. And so they write a letter to Palmer, once again, to Arnold Palmer Latrobe, PA. And they suggest to him that they are doing this and that they're big fans of his and he was a great bunker player and they admire him. So he writes back to them, Wally and Jeff. Dear Wally and Jeff, great hearing from you. I'm gratified by your letter. It is good to see such admirable spirit displayed by our men in Vietnam, and I send my sincere wishes for your safe return to Chicago and very soon. I'm also sending you under separate cover 2 new wedges, sand wedges, and a supply of golf balls which should be arriving in the very near future from the Arnold Palmer Company in Chattanooga, Tennessee, which of course was his company. Hope you enjoy the clubs. However, I hope you won't be hitting too many shots out of bounds. They could hit the shot out of bounds and the Viet Cong are waiting. So he was worried about him. Then these guys get home safely from Vietnam. They're back in Illinois. And one of them goes to Olympia Fields, the country club in the south suburbs, which has tournaments every now and then. They used to have the Western Open there, which was a tournament Palmer won 4 times. And Palmer is there playing in the tournament, and the one guy walks up to him, and I said, I'm one of the guys you sent sand wedges to in Vietnam. And Palmer says to them, this is a few years later, are you Jeff or Wally? How do you do this? No notes. I mean, and it turned out it was Wally. So now here he also got some other types of letters. Dear Mr. Palmer, my sister and my brother and I go to camp every summer in Ligonier, which is right near Latrobe, Pennsylvania. Last summer, my brother came home with his bag full of clean underwear because he wore only 1 pair for the whole week. And then she says, but that is neither here nor there. The reason but that was how she opens the letter to Arnold Palmer. What do you suppose the brother thought of that? Now, Palmer was a great friend of President Eisenhower. Eisenhower was a serious golfer, as some of you may remember. He was in the White House for 8 years. During the 8 years, he played an average of 60 times per year. That would be 480 rounds of golf while he was President of the United States. In 1 year, he played 121 rounds. That was his biggest year. And he didn't disguise it. He didn't hide it. He's a golfer, and he loved to play. And he loved to play Augusta National, which is the home of the Masters. Now, it's almost impossible for a typical golfer to get on Augusta National and play golf. However, Eisenhower, Supreme Commander, President of the United States, guess what? They let him on the golf course. And so he would play with Palmer, and they became great friends. And both of them had serious smoking habits. If you read about Eisenhower, during the Normandy invasion, he was smoking 5 packs a day. It's almost inconceivable. And Palmer, one of his typical poses was he's walking down the fairway, he's puffing on a cigarette, and he would toss it to the side. Most of them were still, you'd only have 3 or 4 puffs, he's got to hit the ball again. And so they both had smoking habits, so they were both on each other's case about quitting smoking. And each one quit smoking about 20 times. So Eisenhower, Palmer also played with Nixon and with Kennedy. And Nixon thought it was bad politics to be playing. Nixon was a good golfer. He thought it was bad politics to be out there playing golf, so it always had to be a big secret when he was playing. Eisenhower, he didn't care what people thought. So but when Eisenhower was dying, he was in his final days and weeks, he invites Palmer and his wife Winnie to come and see him in the hospital. Palmer comes to see him, and immediately Eisenhower says to him, "Have you quit smoking off the course yet?" That's what they talk about. You wonder what guys like Eisenhower and Palmer are talking about? Talking about quitting smoking. Palmer was the epitome of the superstar. Before the term was used in sports, he was one of the superstars. And he also set a standard for what superstars would be with his patience and his decency. He was the first golfer to win $100,000 in prize money. He was the first one to win a total of $1 million in prize money. That took him 13 years. Now you can do that in one tournament. He was also a great family guy, and he now has a grandson who is playing on the tour. His name is Sam Sanders. He's 30 years old. He has won 10 tournaments so far in the course of his life. And Palmer's grandchildren, for reasons that even Callahan cannot figure it out, called their grandfather Dumpy. Who knows where this came from? We have 2 grandchildren who call me Goompa. So, I mean, these things happen in life. So, at one point, his grandson was playing golf in college, and he decides it's time to talk to his grandfather. They were very close. And Palmer helped him a lot with his golf game, and they became very close. And so the boy calls Dumpy, and he says to him, "Dumpy, where are you?" And Dumpy says, "I'm with the president." And the grandson says, "The president of what?" And he says, "Of the United States." And he says, "Well, why did you answer the phone?" And Dumpy said, "Because I wanted to talk to you." So here's President Nixon sitting over here, and he's talking to the grandson. But that is the way Palmer was. He has left a legacy of charitable giving that is really impressive. He has a foundation called Arnie's Army, which is his fans, Arnie's Army Charitable Foundation. Now, many athletes have these foundations. They put the money in the foundation. It's a way of avoiding taxation, and a lot of these athletes do it. I'll give you one example. Michael Jordan had a foundation here in Chicago several years ago. He put money in there, but the only expenditure was for limousines and air travel for Michael. He never gave any money away. He had to close it down when he got caught. John McEnroe, the tennis player, same thing. He had a foundation, and he forgot to give any money away. He had to close his down. But in Palmer's case, he gives away huge sums of money, and he has now a setup in his estate where money goes in to the foundation each year, close to $15 million, and he has built the Arnold Palmer Hospital for Children in Orlando, the Winnie Palmer, named after his wife, Hospital for Women and Babies in Orlando, and they have a nature reserve that is next to the golf course in Latrobe that they are maintaining. So he has been among the most charitable of all athletes in terms of his giving. So, in terms of this book, if somebody you know and you need to find a gift and they're interested in golf, this is the book. Absolutely. It's a perfectly good book, even for somebody not totally interested in golf, because of the human story of Arnold Palmer and his family and many of the other golfers. You get to know some of the other golfers in here. Palmer, however, stands well above all of them as one of the great characters in the history of sports, and this book is a great tribute to him. Okay, we have time for questions. time for questions. There's always good questions here. Yes?
Basketball. Could you comment on two things? One is Loyola's return to the tournament this year, because I know you've talked about Loyola in the past. And then what I consider to be a travesty with the NCAA's letting North Carolina off the hook on their course grade fixing scandal. So, do you have anything to say about it?
Okay, the first question was about Loyola University on the north side in Chicago, the home of the Ramblers. Are they playing this morning? This afternoon against Miami in the first round of the NCAA tournament. It's a very interesting team, a very interesting coach. It's the first time they've been there since 1985. We did the book here about the 1963 Loyola team, which was a fantastic team. They won the NCAA tournament. They had a team, the 5 starters were 4 African Americans and 1 white guy, a guy named Johnny Egan. It was the first time in the history of college basketball a team that was majority black had won the tournament, because their coaches had refused to play a majority of black players back in the era before the Civil Rights Movement and in the era of Jim Crow. But the coach of the 63 team, and this is what was in the book, he was going to play to win. He recruited these guys. They were terrific groups. The most shocking thing so far in this coverage is the Tribune the other day on the front page had a picture of Jerry Harkness. He was the star of the 1963 team. It's a picture of him today. He looks very old, very old. In fact, unrecognizably old. But meanwhile, he's healthy and happy and he's doing well in life. That was a really interesting team. Now this team has a chance to win today, from what I know, and if they do that, then they're on their way to all sorts of things. So it's a good team with an interesting coach, and was a big surprise to those of us who follow sports. Nobody saw this coming this year. The second half of the question was the academic scandal at the University of North Carolina in Chapel Hill. At the University of North Carolina had been, until this, one of the paragons of honesty and integrity in college sports. They had a reputation as a clean program. There was no cheating. There were no cars for the players. There was no money for the players. They played by the rules. But then, as it turns out, there was a course offered by an adjunct professor of African American studies, and the course was offered, and you could sign up for the course, and the course had no class meetings. You did not write a paper. You just signed up, and you got a B+. Total fraud. A total fraud. The professor was indicted for fraud because the university paid him, an adjunct professor, $15,000 to teach the course, and he never taught the course. Then, as sometimes happens in college sports, somehow everything was taken care of. They dismissed the indictment against them, and at the moment, the University of North Carolina has escaped major sanctions from this. It's probably one of the most egregious frauds in the history of college sports, but at the moment they're doing well. There were football and basketball players in those courses. The football coach was fired. The athletic director was fired. The basketball coach is still there. All the players are still there. So somehow Carolina squeezed and somehow escaped sanctions that I think most people would have expected. It's not the first time that's happened with the NCAA. The enforcement of the rules by the NCAA is very spotty. There are schools with influence, such as Carolina, that escape. There are schools that have no influence, such as University of Nevada, Las Vegas, that get hammered. And so this is part of a pattern that we've seen for quite a while. The other issue with the NCAA is that a number of schools have now been discovered on FBI wiretaps the coaches talking on the phone. For the FBI to tap a phone, the agents must persuade a judge that there's a crime in progress. They're not talking about a crime, it's in progress. That's the law. And there are 25 schools whose coaches have been wiretapped. And so there are 25 places where the FBI thinks there is criminal activity in process, and they're tapping these phones. And they already have, the coach of Louisville has been fired over this, Rick Pitino. He was notorious corrupt coach for a long time. And then the coach of University of Arizona, Sean Miller, is on the edge of being fired. He is on the phone talking about paying a family $100,000 in return for their son coming to University of Arizona to play for the coach. So that's the kind of crime in progress that we're talking about. Okay, another question. Yeah, way back.
What is your opinion on paying college athletes?
What is my opinion on paying college athletes? This is the eternal question in the NCAA, particularly in football and men's basketball. These sports take in literally billions of dollars. The coaches are paid millions of dollars. There are several coaches who make close to $10 million a year in men's basketball and in football. They build these palaces on the campuses that are for the athletes. They'll spend $300 and $400 million on a building for the athletes to use to work out in. So there's all this money coming in, and the young men who produce the income, all they get is a college scholarship. There are many people who say the scholarship is enough, but when you see how much the coaches are getting, how much the university is taking in, there's an inequity, and you think to yourself, these guys ought to get something. The NCAA says no. They must be amateurs. They're not going to get paid anything. And they say that's the tradition, that's the way it's always been, that's the way college sports must be to distinguish them from professional sports. And so there have been antitrust cases filed against the NCAA saying that the NCAA is guilty of price fixing. They're fixing the price of men's basketball and football at zero for the players. And the first case, the players won. They got $5,000 per year for the 5 years that they can play, $25,000 at the end of their career. And then a higher court in California reversed that. And so the players have nothing. There's now a case in Oakland, California, Jenkins versus NCAA, in which the lawyers for the players are seeking unlimited payment for the players, both in men's basketball and in football. That case is going through the pretrial process right now. It will go to Newark, New Jersey for a trial probably early next year, and we'll see what happens in that one. But the law is not at the moment receptive to paying players. There are many people in our culture who feel the players ought to be paid, many people who say they shouldn't be paid. So it's an interesting issue. It'll be resolved in court, not at the NCAA. The NCAA will never pay voluntarily. So the court case is the way it will ultimately be resolved. Yes?
Now, Frank DeFord was one of my favorite authors. Was he Princeton? Did you know him? Pretty good.
Yes, Frank DeFord and I were at Princeton at the same time, the greatest sports writer of all time. He and I were on the college newspaper together, the Daily Princetonian. We had a wonderful staff of people. He became a legend even on the campus. He was such a talented writer. He would he was a year ahead of me. Class of 61, I was 62. And we had a newsroom. This is back in the days of mechanical typewriters. This is a whole different world of newspaper. Yeah, exactly. That's but he would come in. We worked in the afternoon and the evening on the paper every day. He would come in the afternoon. He would take the pass to the local movie theater. He would go and watch the movie that had just arrived that day. And he might stay for an hour of the movie, maybe less than that. Then he would come back to the office, and he'd sit at the typewriter. He's one of these guys, 2 fingers. And he could type really fast. And as fast as he could type, which is very fast, he would write this review of the movie. And he'd run up and he'd slap it on the editor's desk, and we would all read it, and you'd be crying, you'd be laughing. I mean, and he does this with no apparent effort. It's very discouraging to be around him. I have to work on every sentence. I rewrite it 10 times. He would just churn this stuff out. And then he went from Princeton straight to Sports Illustrated. He basically invented what we now call long-form sports journalism, long features. Did some fantastic work. There's a compilation book of his called The World's Tallest Midget. He was 6'5", and the remarkable writer and one of the greats of all time. He was the editor. He left Sports Illustrated in 1989, became the editor of the National Sports Daily, where I worked. He hired me to work there. It was a fantastic editorial product, thanks to him. And then it was a very bad business operation, but so it didn't last very long. But he truly one of the greats, and he did just die a couple years ago in Key West. But if you were to rank all sports writers, he's in the top 5, and I would put him at number 1. The guy I mentioned, the golf writer Dan Jenkins, was probably right behind him. So the one of the great stars. Okay, well, yes.
That's one. Do you, switching over to baseball, do you vote for the Hall of Fame players?
I do not have a vote in the Hall of Fame. You had to be a baseball writer for a certain number of years, and although I've done some baseball, nowhere near enough to be.
I was just thinking, what's going to be the new standard for pitchers, do you think?
For pitchers?
Yeah, since we probably aren't going to see 300 wins.
No, that's a good question. The question is, for a pitcher in baseball to get into the Hall of Fame, there was a time when you had 300 wins, you'd be in automatically.
Right.
Now nobody's going to get close to 300 wins because what happened to Kyle Hendricks in the 7th game? They yanked him out in the 4th inning for no reason. And so the statistics for pitchers are changing. There'll probably have to be new numbers. In this Keith Law book, they describe the new ways of evaluating pitchers. So they'll end up using some of the new numbers. And that's how they'll... And the baseball writers tend to be a club, and they kind of get together to see who's going to be in. Interesting club, but a club nonetheless. Yes?
How do you feel about the Cubs this year?
Well, I am a Cub fan, obviously, and I think this is a better team than we had in 2016. Pitching staff is better. This could be another great year. I don't. The problem they have is the Los Angeles Dodgers and the Washington Nationals. Those are the other 2 elite teams in the National League. The Cubs are right there with them, and if they can get around them, they could be in the World Series again. The pitching staff is better. There's a question about the 9th inning pitcher, the closer. Right now in spring training, everybody looks great, of course. And we have this kid, Ian Happ, who could be a serious leadoff hitter. That would make a big difference. So I'm enthusiastic. I wish we still had Jake Arrieta on the pitching staff, but we don't. We have the Yu Darvish, the Japanese pitcher. Yu Darvish is one of many Japanese players. Cubs are paying him a lot of money, and if you're a baseball player and you come here from Japan, they tell you, you're going to have to learn another language. But in baseball, that's Spanish. There are so many Spanish players. So Yu Darvish is working on his Spanish right now, here to play baseball in America. Isn't that interesting? Yeah. Okay. Oh, here, back there, yeah.
Somewhat just quickly related, you mentioned Pete Rose earlier, and you've also mentioned the Hall of Fame today. Do you think that'll ever happen or ever should because of his baseball ability?
His baseball ability puts him in the Hall of Fame in a minute, no question about it. One of the greatest players of all time. And he has all the statistics and all the numbers. However, he has managed to go out of his way to irritate the lords of baseball. For him even to be on the ballot, the commissioner of baseball must take him off the so-called ineligible list. There's only one guy on the list. I mean, here it is on the bulletin board, Pete Rose. You know, they have to take him off that list. And the only person among the owners, the commissioner works for the owners. So he reflects what the owners think. And the commissioner must take him off the list. The only owner who was lobbying for Rose was George Steinbrenner, the owner of the Yankees, who has died. His son, running the team now, is no fan of Pete Rose. So he has no advocate among owners. So the likelihood of getting in right now is very slim. I'm a lawyer, and you can't help thinking like a lawyer sometimes. He's banned for life. For life. So if he dies, he goes in. That would be my answer. Not that I'm wishing anything bad to happen to him, but that would be the lawyer's answer to the deal. Yeah, and then behind it, yeah.
I want to know, it seems like sports books have the longest subtitles of any genre of book. Why is that?
Somebody in the world of book publishing decided that you had to have the content of the book and the title. You know, you couldn't just hear Arnie. You know, that's not enough. You have to say the life of Arnold Palmer. And then there's one with Zen and the best team in baseball. That's been the case for the last 18 or 20 years. And somehow that's the way they look at books that are about sports in the world of publishing. So it's and how they got to that, what the rationale was, I'm afraid I don't know. But you're absolutely right. There's a couple of words, and then a colon, and then many words. I mean that's the format.
And I have to say, every year, and Lester does 2 books, it's really hard to fit it on this sheet.
Because the titles are too long. Yeah. I'm gonna write to Random House and tell them Books Between Bites needs shorter titles. But I'm gonna explain it to them. Yeah. Okay. Yes.
Where's your red tie?
Oh, my red tie! I forgot it today. Yeah.
Like a White Sox fan.
That's a terrible thing to say. Terrible thing to say. Okay, one more. Here, yes.
Do you expect to see any change of the pace of play in baseball?
Oh, the question was, do I expect to see any change in the pace of play of baseball? There are people who think baseball moves too slowly. I'm a baseball fan. It doesn't bother me that the game takes a long time. I'm happy to watch the game. There's always something going on. But they want to attract millennials and other young people to the ballpark, and so they want to speed it up. The players are resisting anything that increases the pace of the game. And the Players Union is the smartest and the richest and probably the most powerful union in all of American labor. So the owners have to figure out a way to get the players to make the changes. Right now, the players are not going to put up with any changes, so I would say no. I would say no.
Get rid of the commercials.
Yeah, but they add time. You know, there's like 2.5 minutes. The world's between innings, 3 minutes of the playoffs. Yeah, one more. Okay.
What about the Russians and the doping scandals in the Olympics?
Well, the question was, what about the Russians and the doping scandals in the Olympics? We will always have athletes, elite athletes, who want to get an edge so that they can win, and they will find performance-enhancing drugs to help them do that. And in the Olympics, just to take swimming as an example, the difference between a gold medal and a silver medal can be 2/100ths of a second. And so every edge is important. And so athletes performing at that level have enormous incentives to use these drugs. And the sports establishment, the Olympics establishment, is against it. And so they test, and if they catch somebody, they're out and they lose their medal. There is now developing a body of thought that would say, if you're an athlete at that level, not somebody 15 years old in high school, but if you're an athlete at that level and you want to use these drugs, let them use them and just see who wins. And that's the end of it. There are some articles that are coming out suggesting that, and it's kind of a libertarian personal responsibility approach. There is no evidence that these drugs cause permanent damage to the athletes. They allow them to be bigger, stronger, and faster, and the athletes who do the drugs are the ones who work out the hardest. It's not just automatic inject testosterone and get stronger. You have to work out longer. The whole purpose of the drugs is to allow you to recover faster and work out harder and longer, and therefore be better. So it's the intellectual structure of the issue is changing, but in the meantime, if you're caught now, you're out. The enforcement is a little spotty. The testing is not 100% accurate. There have been many false tests, false positives that have harmed a lot of people, but it remains an issue. And in Russia, under Vladimir Putin, it was systematic. There was a whole structure of people, and they were in the anti-doping office. They put them in the anti-doping office so that they could provide the dope to the athletes. And now that one of them has come over to the West and is spilling the beans. So it's they were banned from the Olympics in Korea. I think that'll be the end of it, but we'll see. We'll see.